Welcome to Reinvent and the Reinvent American Foreign Policy series, where today we're going to be looking at really fundamentally rethinking Washington's counterterrorism strategy. I'm Pete Leiden. I'm the founder of Reinvent, and I will be helping moderate the conversation today. Now, since the recent terrorist attack in Paris, and in the even more recent attack in San Bernardino, there has been an inordinate amount of public kind of focus now on America's counterterrorism strategy. A lot of the Republican presidential candidates are kind of beating the war drum in some ways and kind of working off a playbook that kind of came out of the post-9/11 kind of period there with the George Bush administration. And just Sunday, President Obama went into national television and basically laid out essentially a reiteration of his lighter touch strategy that he's been carrying out in various degrees for the last 7 years. This roundtable is going to really look at alternative approaches to combating global terrorism. We're going to talk about what have we learned, what's not working, and we can do it better, but also to really think fresh on different ideas, different approaches to how we might adopt new policies in the future here. Now, to help us in this, we're really lucky today to have Mark Danner helping us lead this conversation. Mark is a prolific author who's written quite a few books in foreign affairs. He's a longtime journalist, including a long stint as a staff writer at the New Yorker, and he's a professor now. He's teaching in University of California, Berkeley, as well as has a post in Bard College. So we're really lucky to have Mark actually driving the conversation today. We're also grateful to our partners in this series, which is Plowshares Fund, and three key individuals: Guy Saperstein, Dan Berger, and Katrina Vanden Heuvel. All three of them have been very instrumental in helping get this off the ground. Now, besides Mark, we've also got a terrific group of folks here for the roundtable discussion. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go around the roundtable, have each of them introduce themselves, and what we say around here is like what you bring to the table, a little bit about how you relate to the topic at hand here. And the first we're going to basically talk to is, or introduce, is Rachel. Rachel Kleinfeld is a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So, Rachel, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and introduce yourself here.
Absolutely, Peter. I'm so glad to be here. And I'm a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I study conflict, violence, and fragile states. And unfortunately, most insurgency comes from states in which there's autocracies or violence going on internally. So that's what I look at and have been looking at for well over a decade now. Thanks so much.
Terrific, great to have you here. Now, in the next, we also are fortunate to have Stephen Walt here, and he is a professor of international relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. Stephen, give us a little bit more on your background.
Well, I've been studying international relations and international security policy for about 30 years now. For 15 years at Harvard, before that at the University of Chicago and at Princeton. I write a lot about U.S. foreign policy, U.S. national security policy, and I do a weekly column at Foreign Policy magazine where more often than not I appear to be writing about terrorism, U.S. Middle East policy, and a variety of things connected with that, especially over the last decade or so.
In fact, I might add, he just came out with a terrific piece yesterday, just in time for this roundtable, on 5 things the next president needs to be thinking about in terms of this, and it's extremely relevant, and we'll be sure to, we've been tweeting about that, and also we'll put it on our page here so anyone can read that after the fact here. Okay, next we're going to have Suzanne Nossel, who is essentially the executive director of PEN American Center. Suzanne, tell us a little bit about your background.
Hi, thanks for having me. I run PEN American Center, which is a free expression organization that's based in New York and works all over the world. Prior to that, I've been both in other human rights organizations, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and also served 2 stints at the State Department during the Obama and the Clinton administration. I also write a column for foreign policy, although it's definitely not every week. It's about once a month. I wrote an article years ago called Smart Power that sort of launched that term and concept. Thank you.
It's great to have you here. And then we've also got John Soltz, who's essentially the co-founder and the chairman of VoteVets.org, and also has served quite a few stints in the military in the Middle East there. So, John, tell us a little bit about your background.
Thanks a lot. I'm John Soltz, chairman of VoteVets.org, which is the largest progressive military organization in the country. We have over 450,000 veterans, military family members, and online activists throughout the country. Obviously, helping veterans run for office and get their voices out there as well. Personally, my own military background, served as an armored platoon leader in Kosovo first, and then went to Baghdad in 2003 after the initial invasion with 1st Armored Division. Worked on truck operations there, and then I redeployed to Iraq again in 2011, working in northern Iraq, training the Iraqi army along with the Kurdish Peshmerga embedded, and was one of the last advisors out of northern Iraq, and left finally the country in December of 2011.
Terrific. Great to have you here, John. And as awesome as this group is, we have a saying around here, nobody's as smart as everybody. And we know there's people watching this live. Be sure to, you can add comments on the page there in the reinvent.net site. You can also, using the hashtag Reinvent in Twitter. We'll have folks keep an eye on that. And in the various places you might be seeing this, do put your suggestions in there. We might actually circle it into the conversation. If not, we'll use your insights as part of the write-ups and videos and graphics that will come out of this conversation. So now let's go back to Mark. And Mark, you have a kind of way of framing a couple paradoxes we face right now, and I think it's a good way to start the conversation. Why don't you do that, and let's have our discussion begin.
Thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I was struck by how Peter began the discussion by talking about what's going on the last couple of weeks since the Paris attacks and the San Bernardino attack, which is that we've been stirred into a kind of maelstrom of domestic politics in which, on the Republican side, we've had a lot of hardline proposals, especially from Donald Trump, but other candidates as well. These, it seems to me, are driving the conversation about terrorism policy right now. And I guess I'd begin by making the rather simple point, but it seems to me a very important one, that terrorism isn't an issue simply of foreign policy, that is deeply bound up with domestic politics, and that when it works well, when terrorism works well, that is, essentially they get our politics in their hands, which is exactly the situation we're in right now, and it's one of the paradoxes that I'd like to begin with. It seems to me, as a general theme, we can say that since the attacks of September 2001, September 11, 2001, U.S. policy has been subject to what might be called the strategy of provocation. That is, Al-Qaeda and now the Islamic State has had certain foreign policy goals of their own, and they have been remarkably successful, at least in my opinion, in making the U.S. conform to those goals and do essentially what they want. I'd like to make reference quite quickly to a fascinating document written by a man named Saif el-Adel, who was a special forces colonel in the Egyptian army and was the right-hand man of Osama bin Laden. He wrote this document, so far as we know, in 1999. It's called Al-Qaeda's Strategy to the Year 2020. I'm going to give you briefly his points about what Al-Qaeda should do. He's writing in 1999, a couple of years before 2001. Number one, provoke the United States and the West into invading a Muslim country by staging a massive attack or string of attacks on U.S. soil that results in massive civilian casualties. Excuse me. Number two, incite local resistance to occupying forces. Number three, expand the conflict to neighboring countries and engage the United States and its allies in a long war of attrition. Number four, convert Al-Qaeda into an ideology and set of operating principles that can be loosely franchised in other countries without requiring direct command and control. And finally, number five, the U.S. economy will finally collapse by the year 2020 under the stress of multiple engagements in numerous places. Such Al-Qaeda in 1999. A second policy statement from the Islamic State, and this one is much more briefly, comes from a book called The Management of Savagery by a man who at least went by the name of Abu Bakr Naji, and he demanded that the Islamic State or other jihadist organizations should work to expose the weakness of America's centralized power by pushing it to abandon the media psychological war and war by proxy until it fights directly. If you look, I mean, the final statement of strategy I would suggest is the notion that attacks staged by the Islamic State should eliminate the gray zone. That is, should polarize societies so Muslims have to choose between apostasy and joining the Islamic State. All of these things are stated goals of the adversaries, the terrorist adversaries of the United States. And I would suggest that one of the fascinating things in September 11, 2001 is the degree to which the United States has helped these adversaries. That if Osama bin Laden had woken up on September 12, 2001, and you had said, in 14 years from today, there's going to be not only Al-Qaeda, but another international terrorist network that holds territory the size of the United Kingdom, governs 8 or 9 million people, and is actively gaining recruits at the rate of 1,000 a month, I would say he would have been quite startled and amazed that such success, I mean, obviously these organizations are rivalrous, but such success for the jihadist project could have been achieved in that space of time. So I think one of the main paradoxes here today is the strategy of provocation, and to put that in other terms, how does the United States design a counterterrorism policy that will not actually help the enemy recruit, help the enemy gain force, help the enemy gain popularity around the world, and expand the jihadist cause? First paradox. Second paradox, which I'll state much more briefly, is simply that the United States, especially under President Obama, it seems to me has focused on basic tactical goals, that is preventing attacks at all costs, while the broader, longer-term strategy has suffered. Even as drones, special forces raids, and so on, Obama's supposed light footprint has been used to keep the country safe from attacks on American soil. Some of these policies have contributed to the growth of the jihadi project in ways I've just detailed. So I guess my general question to my colleagues today is, not only do we need, it seems to me, to rethink counterterrorism, but we have to somehow add into this mix the political forces that we're now seeing emerge in front of us that tend to take a policy like Obama's so-called light footprint and expand it into a broader policy. We see the pressure for so-called boots on the ground. We see the pressure for a stronger response. We see the pressure to isolate Muslims at home. We have heard Trump's proposal not to let Muslims into the country, for example. We see all of these things, which are not, strictly speaking, foreign policy proposals. They are the political effects of terrorist attacks. And those political effects, it seems to me, are what are most salient in causing the United States to take actions that are self-defeating and ill-advised. So it seems to me the goal here is to try to devise a counterterrorism policy, or at least changes to the current one, that will not help them in ways they have already designed for us to help them. And I'd like to raise that question, I guess, as a first question, perhaps going to Steve Walt to start.
Okay, Mark, that was a terrific introduction, and I'm looking forward to hearing what other people have to say on this topic. But let me start with at least one issue, the one that I think has motivated me or galvanized me for really the last 10 or 15 years, which is how we keep the actual danger that these organizations pose in some perspective. I think one of the great failures of American counterterrorism policy, really since 9/11 forward, has been the failure to address what I think is a case of essentially threat inflation, where Americans believe the danger from terrorism is vastly greater than it actually is. If you look at the calculations made by people like John Mueller and Mark Stewart in their book Chasing Ghosts, the actual danger an American is going to be killed by terrorists is about 1 in 4 million. Yet, of course, Americans think the problem is much graver. They actually think that there are active terrorists that are going to attack them at any moment. And once you've essentially established that climate of fear where the danger is perceived as enormous and imminent, then of course it's much easier to justify any number of activities, whether it's threats to civil liberties at home or counterproductive actions abroad. And I think one of the great failures, again, beginning with the Bush administration, was not to try and put the threat in some perspective and establish from the very beginning that this was in fact a very minor risk. It was a much smaller danger than many other dangers that we live with on a daily basis, and that therefore our response to it had to be sober, calm, deliberate, and measured. And just one final point that goes along with this is I think we have not devoted enough effort to essentially building a certain degree of political and emotional resilience in the United States. There was a terrorist attack here in Boston a couple of years ago, the Boston Marathon bombing, and this was a horrible event. But if you come to Boston now, the city is thriving. The Red Sox didn't do particularly well, but the rest of the city is doing quite well. We recover from these events, and instead of viewing our society as being constantly vulnerable to what are ultimately relatively weak actors, we have to, I think, come to see ourselves as more resilient, more capable of recovery, and therefore not as likely to succumb to precisely the playbook that our adversaries have laid out and that you summarized so well.
You know, let me jump in and simply say that I think what you've just described is at the heart of the terrorist problem. That is, terrorism, the product of terrorism is not death, it's not destruction, it's fear, and it's irrational fear. And I think it's what you said I completely agree with, but it's like saying in the face of irrational fear, get rational. And we're seeing a moment right now where, you know, we happen to be talking at a time when you just see irrational fear abroad in the land. I mean, it's a fact that if you talk about people who have been who've died at the hands of terrorists on U.S. soil in the last 14 years, more have died through lightning strikes. That indeed is a fact. But it seems to me a difficult problem to simply say people should be rational when we're looking at a problem that has to do with, at its essence, irrational fear. Maybe Rachel would like to comment on that.
Thank you. I think actually that you're absolutely right, and Steve's absolutely right about the level of fear in America being outproportioned. I was talking to some students at CU in Colorado University and said, look, you're much more likely to get killed by a school shooter, and that's what you should really be worried about than this threat. But there are people who should be worried about this threat, and those are the people in the region, not just Syria. We talk a lot about ISIL, but of course Boko Haram has killed more people than ISIL in this past year in Nigeria, and in Algeria and Mali, that whole region, you have a Sahel-based threat going on. I think one of the things we in America need to look at is how do we get less US-centric and focus on helping these people counter the threats in their own area, because they are the ones at risk. And they're the ones who can solve the problems. Ultimately, terrorism comes from poor governance. These governments that treat their people badly, that create grievances, and that terrorists can glom onto, grab onto, and turn into a jihadist threat, what was a local threat of one sort or another, or a local grievance of one sort or another. Helping those governments become better is something that requires work, but not military work, and will ultimately be the way that we try to fight terrorism abroad.
But again, I guess I want to push back a little here and say we're sitting here and essentially saying we should act rationally. That is the answer to the calls right now for boots on the ground, which I should remind everyone, including our viewers, have resulted in, indeed, boots being sent on the ground. We are now sending special forces troops, a handful of them to Syria, more will probably follow. The political pressures that have been unleashed by the attacks in Paris and the attack in San Bernardino is having a direct effect on policy. and will continue to have a direct effect on policy. And it's my thesis here today that the key sort of node of the terrorism problem is not simply a foreign policy problem. How do we handle this? It's a problem of how to withstand domestic political pressure to do things that are not necessarily very intelligent or, at their worst, counterproductive. And our answer seems to be, well, we should be rational and we shouldn't be fearful. But in fact, I think I would plead with everybody here to put themselves in President Obama's position when he had to make that speech the other night, which he clearly didn't want to make on Sunday night, to calm people down. He's a hyper-rational kind of guy, obviously. He agrees with Steve Walt and Rachel that we should look at this rationally. We shouldn't be that fearful. We should realize that the odds are not great, that you're going to be hurt by terrorism. We should realize that people in the region are much more prone to be hurt by terrorism. None of these things will help him withstand the political pressures that are now making him act in the way he's acting, or making Hillary Clinton propose the things she's doing, or making Donald Trump propose the things he's proposing. So I guess I would go to Suzanne and try to return us, at least for the start of this conversation, to the question of fear. And my proposition is that fear is essential to this problem, and fear goes directly into the policy process by way of domestic politics. And we're seeing this happen, and until we can do something to withstand it, circumvent it, satisfy it, suppress it, whatever the phrase is, we are still going to be doing self-defeating things. Suzanne?
Well, I think fear is a powerful piece of the equation, and it's not something you can wish or will away, just because it's irrational. I think part of the answer is explaining publicly and forcefully, that this is the very logic by which the terrorists operate, and that by reacting to it in the way that they want, we play into their hands and we make things even more dangerous for ourselves. Now that, that's sort of an intellectual argument that may be hard for people to understand or really internalize, but I think they can to some degree, and I think President Obama began this the other night by saying we're not going to have boots on the ground in substantial numbers because that is precisely what they want. So he drew the line there, and I think that was important. I think the continuation of that sort of forceful public argument about the logic of terrorism and how you can subvert it needs to be much more at the forefront. I think it was really missing over the last 10 years. There was very little of that. There's a sense we've got to respond aggressively and get in there without thinking about the possibility that that was exactly what they wanted. I think in some ways, perversely, Trump, by being so over the top and so demagogic, there may be a silver lining to that, which is that there's sort of it doesn't feel right or sit well with a lot of people, including a lot of the Republican candidates. And so then there's a search for, what's a more rational way to approach this? What's an approach to this that's more consistent with our values? And I think that, I liked Steve bringing up the example of Boston and sort of the Boston strong ethos, because I think there's something there in greater resiliency. I mean, the Israelis are probably the most powerful example of this because they've become inured to acts of terrorism in their daily lives, and I think we need a piece of that resiliency. We probably do need to train ourselves, and it's partly the media, it's local officials, it's federal officials, it's opinion leaders, in terms of how we react to these incidents to kind of, we're so, I think our horror is very natural, and it's grounded in having had so many, decades of nothing ever happening on U.S. soil. But that's changed, and I think we need leadership to help us overcome some of the kind of impulsive, fear-driven responses and kind of come in more quickly with the sort of Boston strong ethos that makes these incidents a little less rattling and thereby a little less effective for those that perpetrate them.
Yeah, I think this is what President Obama was trying to provide the other night, was some kind of leadership in the face of this kind of demagogic rhetoric. But we should say that the demagogic rhetoric has been with us certainly since September 11th, 2001, and that each time we have an attack, even if it's an attack abroad, we get a rise in the rhetoric of fear and the politics of fear. It's like a fever chart. over our politics. I wanted to talk to John for a second. As Rachel was talking, I was remembering a moment in Iraq in 2004 when I was going out on a night operation with some soldiers in Baghdad, and I asked the operations officer of this unit who was planning this raid. Clausewitz talks about the point of the massing of gravity, the gravitational force, the point at which you would attack the enemy. And I said, at what point, where are the Iraqis attacking us? What do they see the point to destroy? And I remember that this guy thought for a moment, and he said, well, for the Iraqis to win this war, to win the war against us, they have to destroy the will of the American people. I remember he had completely a political interpretation of this. They have to destroy the will of the American people. And that by his lights, the American withdrawal would have actually been a success. That is, they just destroyed the will of the American people. And I wanted to ask you, as a soldier and an ex-soldier, how do you deal with political motivations and political struggles that are essentially being carried on above your pay grade in the political realm, but that have everything to do with whether you win or lose a war, that are absolutely essential to it?
Well, I mean, I think everybody has an opinion, obviously, inside the military, and I think what you're referring to is the center of gravity theories, which we talk about. Operational centers of gravity is where people that you fight gain strength from. Look, I think I live in this unique space of being an Army reservist, so I don't want to give the impression that anything that I say here is representative of the military, but also obviously working in politics. So, I sort of thread that needle very successfully. So I think, inside the professional military, there's always things that we do or don't do that we agree with. And, I've served under people I admire, and I've served under people I don't. And, I think if you're going to have a strong military and a military that you can trust, you have to have the best people. And nobody agrees with everybody, all the time. And I think there was a variety of interpretations throughout the Iraq conflict of centers of gravity, operational centers of gravity, how to defeat the enemy, how they can defeat us. I think we could hash that out over Syria as well. But I think overall in the military, you sort of are wearing the role that you're playing at that moment, and you can't as much worry about whether or not you agree with a political opinion. And I think that's sort of par for the course.
Let me sharpen the question, if I may. I'm sorry, I think I was a little vague in how I asked you. If you look at what the Islamic State is doing now, what their operations are now, the series of operations over the last month, which began with two suicide attacks in Beirut, the bombing of a Russian airliner over the northern Sinai, the commando-style attacks in Paris, and then if we would like to ascribe this to the Islamic State, as we speak, it's still somewhat murky, the connection, the attack in San Bernardino. When you look at these attacks, and could you put yourself in their place as a military thinker and say, what is the center of gravity that the Islamic State is trying to destroy?
Well, the center of gravity is at some level, when we're talking about counterinsurgency, an outdated term, because the way it's taught to us in military doctrine, if you go to the Commander General Staff College or the Air Power School or any of these other institutions, is our strength. So, as a nation, we have obviously an operational center of gravity that's our military, but that's not exactly how the game's played any longer. So, really what ISIS is doing is, they're doing attacks across the region that give them, sort of a public relations victory, a victory that allows them to recruit more jihadists, a victory that allows them to show that they're successful and really makes them stronger inside the paradigm they're in. I mean, they are relatively contained operationally, in Iraq and Syria for that matter. They're not going to go much further east and control battle space before they reach Bashar Assad's center of gravity, which is a legitimate Syrian army. they're not going to be able to go, or excuse me, they're not going to go further west. They won't be able to go much more further east. So if they're coming after us, and when you talk about these things, it's hard for me to say they're going after the United States center of gravity militarily, but they're certainly striking a cause of fear. And we talked about politics a minute ago. It wasn't until ISIS started cutting heads off that the American public had any idea who they were. I can promise you, being embedded in northern Iraq in 2011, the Al-Qaeda flag was the same flag as the ISIS flag. These were people that were killing Iraqi soldiers. They're people that were killing American troops on the grounds, and they were the people fighting Bashar Assad. So, we've known who these people are, but until they started with this PR operation, which is, by the way, impressive at some level. I mean, the videos that they're making, their public relations capabilities are phenomenal. But I really think they're speaking to their base of jihadists throughout the region to recruit, and that's really what they're trying to do. And anytime they scare us, and anytime they prevent Americans from doing something, or they shut down Western Europe, at some level they have success because it brings more jihadists towards them. I think the political ramifications for us are huge. As soon as the heads were decapitated last fall, we spent about $7 or $8 million in election cycle. Republican candidates benefited tremendously. In the internal polling that I'm privy to right now, Democrat generically is losing the ISIS conversation by almost 30 points. ISIS polling is one of the top 1 or 2 questions for swing voters in this country right now. And the president has a 60% disapproval rating on his handling of the situation. So these, from a macro standpoint, are issues that are
John, I think
we've lost that feed.
We might lose that feed, but I think Stephen wanted to jump in here. Stephen, do you want to pick up right there from that?
Yeah, I thought John made a number of really good points here, and it ties back to Mark's original point that this is ultimately as much about our own politics as it is about the foreign policy or direct national security implications of all of this. I wanted to add a couple of things to this. I mean, first of all, I think there's never been a sustained effort by any president since 9/11 to calibrate the actual danger that we face, to point out that terrorism has always been a weapon of the weak. It's not a weapon used by powerful states who can accomplish their aims in other ways. It's done by relatively weak organizations, and by any objective standard, ISIS is still a remarkably weak organization, despite what we occasionally read. So President Obama gave a speech where he tried to reassure us, but it was not a particularly good speech. It was actually remarkably thin on actual facts, on what the real dangers that Americans face are. And it's a tricky rhetorical question because you can't appear to be indifferent to the victims of a terrorist attack. You have to show some recognition of the human tragedy there. But I think both President Obama, but also lots of other officials in the U.S. government should be engaged in a sustained campaign to put this actual danger in perspective and remind Americans that they are, in fact, much safer than they have been led to believe. Which then brings me to the second problem, which we haven't yet discussed, and that's the way this gets covered in the media. I'm a big believer in a wide open media conversation, but this is a case where, in fact, most media organizations in the United States are making this problem worse. Whenever anything happens anywhere, it becomes a 24/7 cable news frenzy, and in order to sort of keep eyeballs glued to the screen, you will have this constant drumbeat of, are you scared enough, coming out of CNN and Fox and lots of other places. And this is, of course, precisely what ISIS wants. It wants as many people as possible watching the things they've been able to do and blowing it out of all proportion. And it seems to me until we get ahead of that particular problem as well, we are playing right into their hands.
It's interesting. I guess I challenge you. I, again, find myself in the interesting position of agreeing with everything you just said, except the basic principle, because it seems to me that on the one hand, we're talking about rationality, but terrorism is about irrationality. It's about fear. Fear is the most lucrative political emotion, and politicians seize on fear because it's so powerful. It's not that the Republicans at this moment are irrational. They're seizing on fear for perfectly rational reasons. So they're seizing on irrational emotions for perfectly rational reasons. Trump, since the Paris attacks, has gone up 6, 7, 8 points, depending on the polls. At the same time, the media, the press that you're talking about now, sees on these phenomena also for perfectly rational reasons. They get lots more eyeballs. And you know, the commercial press, the cable news networks and so on, work by how many eyeballs they've got. So it seems to me that we're essentially opposing to these rather primal forces the idea that, well, you know, politicians should speak more reasonably and try to put the threat in perspective. And you know, Obama famously said just before the Paris attacks that ISIS was contained. And of course, he was talking about it in terms of territory in Syria and Iraq, but he was completely lambasted for this because he seemed to not represent how primal and horrible the threat was. So, as you point out, it's a tricky rhetorical matter for a politician to try to minimize or indeed encapsulate the threat, because he seems to be not appreciating the threat itself. And you see what has happened to Obama as a result of this. So I guess to get back to what I said at the beginning, I think what you're saying is very judicious, but I wonder if it doesn't miss the point.
Just in response, it seems to me we first have to start off by diagnosing the problem, which is what we're doing here, and then asking ourselves if there's ways within our political system we could address those or try to correct them. And I think, you know, so far, yes, there's a problem for political leaders, although again, going all the way back to the Bush administration, they made choices on how they were going to respond to 9/11. They did not have to respond as they did. It seems to me they could have framed what happened to us on September 11th in a different way, in fact, a more Churchillian fashion, that, you know, this is a problem, this is something we have to defeat, but it is not something that we should be as fearful of as they want us to be. I think in their case, they actually panicked, and as you have written about at some length, reacted in a series of ways that ultimately made the problem worse. I think the Obama administration has had a somewhat more measured view of the problem and a slightly different tactical response, but they've also not done a particularly good job of putting this actual danger in some perspective, and in a sense have ceded much of the rhetorical ground to the opposition that has played on fear in precisely the way that you have described.
Mark, you got to unmute there.
I was asking Suzanne whether she'd like to comment on trying to put together a policy that would try to avoid the pitfalls of giving in to political pressure exacerbated by fear.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you, Mark. I think the idea of that political leaders can sort of just play down how threatening or scary this is, it really isn't viable. I mean, he made the comment about ISIS being contained. He also made the comment about there being the JV team, and I don't think either of those helped. You know, I just don't. I mean, you know, maybe it was just you know, sort of infelicitous phrasing, but I'm not sure there's anything President Obama or the political candidates could say that would really convince people that this is less frightening than they think it is. I think, you know, the question is how you have a sort of measured, calm response that's governed by your own interests and not dictated by the logic of the terrorists, but that at the same time, you know, can't be pilloried as, you know, weak, cowering, lacking in force and velocity, because that's you know, that trope is something that I think politically American public is very vulnerable to. You know, especially when we feel threatened, we don't like anything that sort of smacks of passivity or not rising aggressively to a challenge and punching back. So I think that's sort of the tightrope to walk here. I think it's not totally dissimilar from, you know, where we were in the early 2000s, when it had sort of become clear that the Iraq War was a mistake, and yet the question was, well, how do you respond to something like 9/11 in a way that doesn't look like that, but that also doesn't look weak. And that, that's part of what smart power kind of grew out of, because we had a hard power strategy. There were people arguing for soft power, but nobody wanted anything at that moment that felt soft. So the effort with smart power is to sort of synthesize it and have a way of coming back against a hard power centric strategy, but that did not seem sort of weak or milquetoast. And I think here, I think one of the problems with the president's speech the other night was, he was very measured and calm, but he didn't identify anything new that we're doing. And I think there's a sense that the scale and the nature of this, when it reared its head in San Bernardino, and you saw, an individual born and raised in this country who became radicalized, who had none of the obvious markers of radicalization, who wasn't visible, wasn't on any watch lists, wasn't visible on social media, hadn't triggered any suspicion, going out and planning such a meticulously executed attack, like that was a sea change for people. And I think it really shaped what people feel we now have to fear, that we weren't afraid of last week, but now maybe we should be. A mother with a 6-month-old baby, that wasn't frightening, and maybe now we have to reconsider that. So I think one of the questions is, what do you do in response to that? What's sort of the list of things that can make us feel like our government and our society is being proactive, forceful, taking the initiative, and has a commensurate response, but not a response that, simply kind of plays into the hands of those who are perpetrating this?
Well, what would such a response look like?
Well, I think there are a few things, and we've sort of started to talk about some of them. I mean, it does look like there are some changes to the way that we're tracking and investigating people who are coming into this country and where they've been and what they've done, that may need to be intensified. I think that's one piece of it. I think an interesting and really challenging, tricky piece of this is the American Muslim community, and I really sort of feel for people who are part of that community, because I think the Paris attacks were, and the rhetoric that followed that, were incredibly kind of undermining, and put people in a very insecure place. And yet there was sort of a pushback that was mounted as well, and some of it was humorous and lighthearted. But after San Bernardino, I think that becomes harder. But I do think the role of Muslim American leadership in this is really essential, and what kind of message they're imparting to Muslim Americans, in schools, in mosques, in community organizations. I don't think we can avoid the idea that they have an essential role to play. And I think, a joint front. I mean, if you saw political leaders together with Muslim American leaders saying, here are the messages that we're delivering, here are what we are saying to our own people, here are the ways that we're making this conduct less acceptable, less palatable, less attractive. I think that's something people would like to see, and would help make people feel that something relevant is being done.
It's interesting that you're talking about that, because if you do look at cable news, whether it's Fox, MSNBC, CNN, you see that what's driving the conversation right now is proposals by Trump, for example, to not let Muslims into the country, other things like this, which seems to be completely, if you look at the statements of the Islamic State about eliminating the gray zone, and the political effects, for example, of the Paris attacks, the political effects in France with its revitalization of the right and so on. The policy you're talking about with Muslim leaders seems to be very much a defensive one. In other words, the broader political arc of discussion seems to be one of polarization, making the Muslim community feel vulnerable because of these proposals by Trump, and so on. So it's almost as if the demanding leadership from the Muslim community to denounce these attacks and so on is almost a defensive policy in the face of the larger political conversation, at least on the right.
I mean, I don't think it's defensive. I think it's affirmative, and I think there are Muslim Americans who want to play an active and positive role in fostering dialogue and education, about these issues. So I don't look at it as defensive. I think there's a way it can be empowering. I saw this morning on the cable news, there were a lot of Muslim American leaders who were speaking out, quite forcefully and, talking about the breadth of this. I mean, both the feelings of vulnerability that they and their communities have, but also, the really troubling aspects of what is happening and the things that we don't know and understand about how people like this couple can get radicalized. So I think those are good discussions. I think it's really important that those Muslim American voices are being heard, because I think there can be sort of an understandable impulse to just retreat from this because it's a pretty fraught and laden discussion. So I think it's, I see some positive steps to kind of amplify those voices and ensure that they're part of the discussion about how we all react to this.
I'm fascinated by the general expression radicalized and self-radicalized. It seems as if in the last months, and especially a few weeks, this has become a very mysterious notion that could apply to anyone. It's almost as if it's from the era of the Cold War, that invasion of the body snatchers, that anybody could turn into something else, and that it's deeply mysterious radicalization. Whereas it seems to me you look at this and that in many cases it's not very mysterious. It's that the United States is perceived to be an aggressive power killing Muslims, and people, at least some people, eventually turn out to hate that and want to do something about it, very often young people. And I wonder, Suzanne, if you wanted to comment a bit about this notion of radicalization and how it fits into terrorism and counterterrorism policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think, on the one hand, you're right, and there's kind of nothing mysterious about, what it is that they don't like, and there's plenty to dislike in U.S. policy around the world if you're connected to populations that have been affected negatively by it. But on the other hand, I think there is a real element of mystery when you hear the family members of this San Bernardino attacker sort of talking about him and how he grew up. I think they're genuinely, I take them at their word, mystified about how, somebody like this could have committed an act like that. And, there's a story or piece by Malcolm Gladwell in the New Yorker, I think some weeks ago, looking at school shooters, and he sort of makes this argument that it's kind of a slow motion equivalent of how people are drawn into a riot, and that the first people to join a riot are really quite prone to violence, and they don't have a lot of sense of social constraint, and they're maybe very angry, and so they jump right in. But that the 30th or the 40th person to join in the fray, their profile might look quite different. I mean, they're somebody who only after seeing a lot of this and seeing a lot of other people jump in first, does their sort of threshold get met, and do they participate? And I think that's one of the alarming things here is, are there people out there who, would never have done this, but now that they've seen Paris and then San Bernardino, it suddenly kind of seems they feel closer to it and more mobilized and motivated, and some of the things that would have inhibited them have fallen away. So I think that's something that we, have to explore and understand when we, it's sort of for the first time we're really considering, the question of Islamic terrorism that's homegrown. It's something that I think a lot of people didn't really think could or would exist in this country. So I do think there's a lot we have yet to understand about it.
Rachel, do you want to comment on this question of radicalization and self-radicalization?
Well, I'd love to expand the frame a little bit, because I think what we're talking about is actually working on a couple of different levels. One level is the communication level. How do politicians talk about what the American people should feel? Who wants to be told what they should feel from a politician? I've never heard of anyone who thinks that if a politician tells them not to be afraid, they will suddenly not be afraid. People feel what they feel, and fear is a primary emotion. And as Suzanne is pointing out, some of this stuff is really scary. And so the communication aspect of how does a politician take that fear and turn it into something usable so that we can have rational response is one level at which we need to think about this. Another level is the domestic policy level. We are seeing local people being radicalized who are Americans, who are American passport holders. It's a whole different issue than the foreign policy issue, which is what do we do over there? And I think we need to address all three simultaneously. We can't treat the communication aspect as if it has nothing to do with what's happening in the real world. So how do you communicate a good policy? Well, you have to admit that fear. There's, in communication theory, the idea of a seesaw of fear, and the idea is that if one side tamps down fear, the other side goes up. And the more one side tamps it down, the more the other side goes up. And so really, if you have someone who says, oh, let's be rational, let's calm down, the other side says, what? You're telling me I'm irrational? Not useful. So we need a president and we need some leadership who discusses this fear as something that's reasonable, that it's fair to be afraid, but that let's not let the terrorists win here. Let's take that fear and that reasonable fear and do something with it. And that comes to the second element of communication theory, which is you've got to give people something to do. In disasters, they come up with all sorts of things for people to do that are not necessarily useful to the disaster, but they're useful for giving people something to do so that they don't panic. And right now, the only politician giving anyone anything to do is Trump. And Trump is giving really bad things to do. And so what we need is to get ahead of this politically by starting to talk about things we can do. And I think Suzanne's put some great ideas on the table. We get our best intelligence from communities who see people acting strangely within those communities. And we always will. That's how you get good intelligence. And so helping people not to spy on each other Soviet style, but to say, pay attention to the people you love, see if they're acting differently, talk to them about their feelings, that sort of thing, and start to build relationships, more deep relationships between our law enforcement and these communities that might be problematic for one reason or another, so that they can help self-police. And we've done that over the years, but the politicians don't talk about it very much. We've done that with lots of good communities of lots of people who don't want violence within their communities, want to look into that. And then overseas, we need to start giving some options. I'm afraid that President Obama's policies, whether good or not, have not been well communicated. I don't think the American people have a sense of what we're doing to deal with this threat. And so communicating those policies, or in my mind, changing those policies so that they're a little bit more potent, are more useful things to do than what we're doing right now. Changing them in what way? I think we're in the phase of actually making real progress here. Yeah, I think we're dealing with this threat very much on the threat's terms, as you were saying at the beginning. ISIS wants us to do certain things, and we're falling right into that trap. The reality is that America is never going to have as much of a stake in this region as the people in that region. And we need to give the people in that region a reason to fight for themselves. Right now, we told the Sunnis in Iraq, hey, stand up to the insurgents and you'll have a say in your own state. And then we walked away. And so the Shiites had a say in the state, and the Shiites said the Sunnis aren't going to have a say. And then the Sunnis went to ISIL. That's not surprising. We've told the Kurds, you can't have a state to yourself, but we'd sure like you to fight for our cause. Yeah, the Kurds are coming along when it suits them, but this is not it's not rational for any of these people to put themselves on the line if that's what we're going to say. We need to actually deal with the people on the ground, the Kurds, the Sunnis, the Shias, decide what they need to come up and fight either the forces within or the forces without, and then find a way to meet those. And I actually think that Les Gelb and Vice President Biden at the very beginning of the Iraq War put some ideas on the table to give people reasons to fight for their own areas, to basically break up the Middle East again into areas that made more sense. I think it's a proposal that's worth reviving, frankly. It's been over a decade, and we're coming back to that. But that's exactly what's happened. I mean, if you look at Iraq now, essentially you have the Sunni area, which is governed by the Islamic State. You have the Shia rump state of Iraq, which is very much under the sway of Iran, highly influenced by Iran. And you have the Kurdish area in the north. I mean, essentially, the proposal they came up with has, in effect, on the ground, come to pass. The problem is that Sunni state
stretches from Abu Ghraib all the way past Raqqa to the suburbs of Aleppo, which is the Islamic State. But I mean, it seems to me that the borders are being recast. They're being recast in Iraq. They're being recast in Syria. We have what the term of art now calls ungoverned spaces, not only in Syria and Iraq, but in Yemen, in Libya. We can point to other spaces in Somalia, and so on. And you know, President Obama has essentially adopted, it seems to me, a light footprint approach over the horizon, using drones, using special forces raids. And the United States, I mean, the Republicans criticize the Obama administration for leading from behind, for not having a larger footprint in the area, not showing more American leadership. And insofar as the Obama administration has responded lately in policy terms, we're starting to put some more troops in. We're definitely getting more involved. There's no question about it. So I'm wondering if you're saying, and I want to ask this question to John and Steve as well, that we should be doing more of what we're doing, which is to say doing less, having less of an American role in the region. Is that what you're proposing? And why is Obama's evolution of policy that are not what you're talking about?
I'd love to hear what John and Steve have to say, so I don't want to take up all the air. I'll be very brief. I don't think Obama has had a policy that's been particularly useful in the region. What you're saying is de facto happening is in fact de facto happening. We're not in control of it, nor are we having much to do with it. It's being framed by forces on the ground. What I'm saying is the outcome of that is that Iran is getting control of the Shiite areas, that ISIL has gotten control of the Sunni areas, and the Kurds are luckily still in control of their own areas, although it bothers the Turks. If we could get ahead of it and help shape it, you could have more moderate Sunnis, not ISIL, in control of the Sunni areas, and we could have had more moderate Shias in control of the Shia areas by getting ahead of the problem 3-4 years ago. Now that we're in this situation, I think we need to recognize that you need to fight with the forces that you have on the ground. And so we need to start looking at who is on the ground, who has a stake in the situation, who we can live with. And we need to start empowering those actors. The only alternative is for us to be on the ground, and I don't think we should be on the ground any more than we are. The American people don't have the stomach for a long war. And if they don't have the stomach for a long war, we will fail to fight that war to a successful conclusion, and everyone will be worse off in that case.
John, you've both been on the ground yourself and helped see this process by which supposedly we're going to help those on the ground to fight for themselves. What's your comment on this?
Well, I think first, I don't think Rachel's arguing for less intervention in the region. I think that, you know, it's just a different type of intervention. I think that people don't seem to understand that we have limits to our power. And there's limits to American power in the region. There's limits to our military power. So I can tell you that I'm not a fan of indiscriminately tossing weapons into the region. I think outside of the Kurds who govern themselves for essentially a generation under Saddam Hussein's rule, we lose control of that equipment, you know, even when we're there. So I think that's a challenge. I think the other issue is that, you know, the reason Iraq is controlled by the Iranians is because we put democracy in Iraq. And, you know, when you force the hardware of an election, you know, it's like an iPhone. You can have the iPhone, but if you don't have the software, it doesn't work. And imagine an election in the United States where there was no Democrat or Republican Party, and I think you could see the evangelical groups would probably do very well and probably carry the Republican nomination directly. And I think what you see in Iraq and Syria overall, and in many parts of the world where you've had a dictator for a long time, they don't understand the democratic process and there's no software for it. So it only increases the challenge, and I don't necessarily believe that the transition to democracy has been easy, and I don't think that it's left us with an end state that's desirable. But I would stress, you know, there are limits to what we can accomplish, and I don't quite see, you know, the United States being the sole sort of, we are the biggest player, but we are not the sole player, and have any type of success there, we're going to have to do things that we don't want to do, which is talk to people that we haven't talked to. You know, and that includes the Russians and the Iranians and the Saudis and the Turks, who all have interests in these states. And we have to sort of, you know, figure out how do we create an alliance against ISIS. Right now, we're very far from that, specifically because there's you know, this sort of perception that Bashar Assad has to go. I'm certainly no fan of Bashar Assad, but I will tell you that he's got tremendous strategic support from the Russians and the Iranians, and much like in Iraq with the Iraqi government. So I think, you know, we can change the dynamic on the grounds, but there's long been violence. Before we showed up in the region, there'll be violence when we leave, and I think the larger question is, how do we secure our homeland to a point where the situation in the region is contained, where the public doesn't care? Because if we set a standard of, you know, defeating ISIS, I don't see that happening, which is sort of a global movement anytime soon.
Steve, I wanted to ask you, I mean, we certainly are continuing this discussion in a transitional, we seem to be in a transitional period. I don't know if you saw the amazing tape of the ceremony of the so-called breaking of the borders. This is when the Islamic State destroyed the border between Iraq and Syria, and they called it the end of Sykes-Picot, the end of Sykes-Picot. They're celebrating the destruction of the World War I order imposed on the Middle East. There certainly does seem to be some of that going on, the end of a certain imperial order in the region. And how much should we really be concerned about that? I mean, the United States has been the status quo power since at least 1945 in the Middle East. Should it continue to be, or should we be withdrawing and letting, as Rachel suggested, the people in the region deal with this have the responsibility for dealing with this much more than we have in the past?
I agreed with a lot of what they had to say, and the only place I guess I'd push back on you is I don't think we've been entirely a status quo power in the region. Certainly not since 2001, where the United States you know, invaded Iraq to overthrow a government there, has certainly talked repeatedly about regime change in some other places, and then helped out with a regime change in Libya. And we've been pretty actively involved trying to shape the politics in places like Somalia and Yemen as well. I think there's a lesson here, right, that the terrorism problem does not come out of nowhere. And to say that doesn't justify what terrorist groups do, but it's to say it is, to a first approximation, a reaction to many decades of outside interference, you know, beginning with the British and French and then eventually continuing with us as well. And if you look at public opinion polls throughout the Arab and Islamic world, there's often great admiration for many features of the United States and of the West, and there's deep opposition to many aspects of American foreign policy, whether it is our support for some Arab dictatorships or it's our what is seen as unconditional American support for Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. All of these things feed into the narrative that groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS use to recruit people in the region, but also to then get sympathizers elsewhere. And as I think you suggested earlier, you know, they have a strategy here. If they can polarize the politics sufficiently, that in fact is going to win them more support. My own view on this one is that we would be much better off if we were, you know, killing fewer Muslims, much less actively involved there, not trying to play traffic cop or referee in a large multi-dimensional political conflict that is now we're beginning to see throughout the Arab and Islamic world, and that's not going to eliminate the problem because of our prior involvement there and some of our continued connections there, but it is ultimately going to reduce it over time, and that's going to require a certain amount of strategic patience. We are not going to make this problem less severe if we continue to have our fingers very heavily involved trying to shape the politics of that region.
Can I bring you back from grand strategy to counterterrorism strategy for just a second, and maybe we can go around to everyone and ask them to address the simple question, which is essentially one of the reasons we're here, which is, what should our counterterrorism strategy be? How should it be different than what it is now? What would make it more effective? What should be changed? And I want to put that to everyone sitting here. And let's start with Steve.
Well, first of all, I think we need to have more what you might call, cost-benefit analysis. I mean, there's obviously various things we do, whether it's intelligence gathering, watch lists, the various ways we've tried to make it hard for terrorists to travel to the United States. But you don't see very much cost-benefit. The classic example of this, when someone points out that we can kill a lot of alleged terrorists with drones, but we may be creating more than we are actually killing. We've been doing this now through a variety of means ever since September 11th. Indeed, before that, we are constantly being told about all the successes we're having, the thousands of terrorists that we've disrupted or killed, and yet the problem seems to be getting worse. That suggests that there's something not working, and in particular, we're not balancing the expense and effort and possibly counterproductive effects of this policy against what the benefits are. How much more danger would we be in if we were doing less of some of these things? We've never really subjected the entire counterterrorism menu to a sort of straightforward cost-benefit analysis. That's partly, of course, because there are now so many people in the United States with a vested interest in this policy, whether it's the American intelligence agencies that are deeply committed to this, American special forces, which are deeply committed to this, lots of private contractors that make money from the government, hyping the terrorist threat and proposing to solve it for us. I think until we get some more independent eyes on all the things we're doing and what's actually working and what's actually not working, we're undoubtedly going to be wasting a lot of money, but we may also be doing things that are making this worse.
It's interesting that Steve, in making that comment, is echoing most prominently a man named Donald Rumsfeld, who asked a question as Secretary of Defense in 2004 in demanding a metric to judge counterterrorism operations. Are we capturing, killing, or deterring more terrorists than the madrasas are every day producing? I have called that, in various things I've written, Rumsfeld's question, and it seems to me that everybody has to try to answer that. What are things we can do and changes we can make in the counterterrorism policy now that would indeed ensure that the answer to that question was positive? And I think it's unquestionable that if you look at 2001 and look now, the answer to Rumsfeld's question is an emphatic no. State Department figures, U.S. State Department figures say that in 2002 there were 725 terrorist attacks. 2014 there were more than 32,000. That's an increase of 4,000. Now you can quarrel with those numbers, but it's unquestionable that there are a lot more jihadists than there were 14 years ago, and a lot more terrorist attacks. So I guess I would move the question to Rachel, the same question: what should we be doing differently? How should our counterterrorism policy be different than what it is now?
Well, I think our counterterrorism policy, based largely on air-based activity and somewhat on intelligence, really needs to switch that. Our intelligence needs to be increased, particularly our human intelligence, which has been underfunded for years compared to signals intelligence. We need both, but human is always the way you get more deeply involved and understand these situations. And then we really do need to be working more closely with the people in the region. After all, we're not in that region. We're quite far away. And there are people in that region who will be in that region after we leave who we need to be more deeply engaged with. That's not just states. That's not just your Turkeys and Jordans and so on. That's also sub-state actors who will play a major role in determining the end game on the ground. So that's things like looking in Nigeria at the level of corruption going on in Nigeria and the ways in which that corruption is feeding the Boko Haram insurgency. It's looking at why are the Libyans giving their military arms that we gave them and selling them to other insurgents. There's a lot of issues on the ground in these countries that are very far away from the political discussions we're having with Trump that have quite a bit more to do with how you actually solve the problem. And as we involve ourselves more in the local areas, not in a kinetic way, not in a military way, but in a diplomatic way, we will be able to be more helpful in these situations.
Suzanne?
I mean, I think the question that was put on the table, I can't remember by who, about, I think it was John, Assad, and whether the sort of tactical move now is to deprioritize, as noxious as he is and murderous as he is, the fight against Bashar Assad for the time being in order to mount a united front to go after ISIS. I mean, I'm sure that's being debated, and I think it's an important debate because I can sort of imagine that there's a scenario where if that's off to one side and you can get a truly united front where you have virtually every country in the world working against the same goal, I think in terms of the popular mindset on this, the politics here in the United States, I mean, this whole kind of way that Republican candidates pick apart Obama's reference to the coalition. They say it's all these countries that are sitting back and tiny island states. If it truly was a coalition with the United States and Russia and Iran, and the permanent 5 members of the Security Council all genuinely on the same team, I think the psychological dimensions of this would shift. Now, what I don't know well enough is whether if you move in that direction, you then lose, the Arab participation, nominal as some of it is, in this coalition and the Turkish support, because then the strategy doesn't work, or certainly doesn't work as well. And so I think I'm guessing that's a question that they're sort of battling through, because it seems in some ways like a fairly obvious step. So I think you got to think beyond the odiousness of Assad, and the wide belief that he must be ousted, that there's something more to the reluctance to try to sort of sequence this. I think the other piece strategically now really should be kind of a doubling down on American values, an embrace of the American Muslim community, so that we really pull away the argument that they're becoming more and more ostracized and marginalized, because I do think that probably feeds the homegrown element of this. And I think we've seen a little bit of this, but nowhere near enough. And there are the vast majority of American Muslims, I think, can be wholeheartedly part of the solution on this, and that should be something that we really put front and center, and come out in defense of them, and against harmful forms of profiling, against hate crimes, ostracization. I think a dramatic step like closing Guantanamo right now would shift the narrative and kind of give a talking point to people within Muslim communities who are trying to argue for moderation. So I think there's a kind of values front here, grounded in the U.S. Constitution, that could be rallying for the American people, and could help fuel a sort of very public, I think we need kind of a more public campaign against ISIS and what it stands for. It's kind of come to that point now where we should be rallying cultural figures to speak out against this, so that these individuals who are sort of on the fence and being tugged by their social media feed have a counterpull that's not emanating from some strategic communications office at the State Department, which really seems not to have worked, but from a much wider kind of cultural mobilization, rejecting what ISIS stands for.
It's a fascinating point. I agree with just about everything you just said. It does make me despair, though, when you said closing Guantanamo, and I think that one of the things that's happened over the last couple of weeks is we've had the leading Republican candidate for the Republican nomination declare that if elected, he would reinstate waterboarding. Not only would he reinstate it, he would do it even if it's proven not to work, because they deserve it. And it's probably true that most of the candidates on the Republican side, while they probably wouldn't state this quite so baldly, would not want to say that they will not use enhanced interrogation or torture, and they certainly would be dramatically against and vigorously against closing Guantanamo. Let's move to John now, and when I ask about counterterrorism policy, I'm reminded simply if you look at Iraq, what a deep political problem lies beneath the surface of not just the Islamic State, but the division between Sunni and Shia there. What a deeply embedded political problem it is. And I wonder if you could talk about that and talk about your general proposals for how our counterterrorism policies should change.
Well, I think to specifically address Iraq, again, it goes into the fact the Bush administration forced democratic elections very early on in 2005, and the Sunni didn't even show up to vote. So you have a situation on the ground there where the Sunni actually, when I had the opportunity to see Iraq in 2003 and 2011, I don't actually think they believe they weren't the majority in the state. So they boycotted the 2005 vote. They didn't show up. The Iranians were essentially granted control of the country. The leading cleric in the country, Ali Sistani, is obviously Iranian. Not a bad guy at all, but he is like the leading cleric in the country for the Shia voters. So when the Shia showed up to vote, they took control of the state. The militias, the Dawah and Skiri and those militias obviously came to power, and that was sort of the status quo under Maliki for a long time. Maliki had a very hard time in the last election. Ayad Alawi, who was much more moderate, actually won more votes in the parliamentary system, but they flew the prime minister to Tehran, who cut a deal with Sadr, who had killed hundreds of U.S. soldiers in Baghdad in 2004, and they cut a deal, and the hardline Iranians controlled the state. And again, that goes into democracy promotion and pushing democracy where there's no software. So that sort of leads us into this end state as to once we left, the Iranian regime had much more influence with the Iraqi democracy than the United States. And again, it goes into the fact that we can participate in the region, but we struggle with dominating it, specifically in the democratic process, where the only legal structures that are available prior to elections is often religious infrastructure. So that leads us to where we are, now with Iraq. If we're going to have success, we have to bring the Sunni back to the table. And I think you can make a real argument that U.S. Intervention militarily on the side of the Iraqis should be contingent upon their inclusion to Sunnis to the government, which we still really haven't seen. I mean, our real leverage in this is to force the Iraqis to do what we want and then offer U.S. military power, not inverted, which is sort of, where we are in regards to Iraq. In regards to counterterrorism, it's a term, the war on terror that I've never quite understood, because terrorism itself it's a tactic. It's like a drone. There's a big debate about drones. Are you for drones, against drones? Drones are a tactic. I mean, I would certainly use a drone to kill Osama bin Laden if I could. The question is, what's our legal authority to use these things? So I think when you talk about terror and you talk about ISIS, very complicated issues. There are certainly things that I think in the United States that we should be doing more of to protect this country, because if we can prove we can protect Americans, it makes what's happening in the region less important. Obviously we live in a country right now that you can't get an airplane because you're on a terror watch list, but you can go buy an AK-47 at Walmart. You can walk down the road and you can shoot everybody you want. I mean, in 2010, Al-Qaeda did a recruiting poster about our gun law. So there's a variety of those issues. I think, I was fortunate to live in Europe for several years, and, the Muslim community is not as incorporated in society. So when I'm embedded in Iraq, my best force multiplier, better than shooting a rifle, is the 2.5 months the Army gave me of Arabic training. So I certainly agree with Stephanie that the inclusiveness of our Muslim communities and the United States directly going out there and embracing the Islamic community overall is a tremendous force modifier for us. We should be allowing refugees in the country, not sort of pushing them away. I mean, these are the things that make the United States what we are, and really helps us show and isolate, ISIL's message. In regards to them specifically in battle space, I was never supportive of the anti-Bashar movement in Syria, because there was no infrastructure around it, and it was always going to be controlled by the jihadists. And that's what we've seen. And unfortunately, Bashar is a terrible guy, but he's not a guy who's going to attack the United States. So when you look about Path Forward, you have to look at the Russian and the Syrian influence. They have tremendous strategic centers of gravity. The idea that Bashar is going to be gone is a fallacy, and it's something the administration's wedded to. It's something that Hillary Clinton is wedded to, and I think it puts progressives and Democrats in a really hard position going into the election. The only way to trim the battle space that ISIS controls is to work with sort of everybody in the region focus on that target. And I'm not quite sure any military operation will be successful until we can get everybody pointed in the right direction. And right now we're it's completely fragmented.
Do you think, just in military terms, that it makes sense, the rhetoric that you're hearing, certainly from the Democratic side and from the administration, that there will not be American boots on the ground except for special forces operators, and that troops in the region will be doing the hard work of defeating the Islamic State? I mean, is that actually, in truth, a reasonable proposition, given who would be doing the fighting in Iraq and so on?
That's a great question. The Iraqi army's never conducted offensive combat operations without U.S. embedded advisors. It's never happened. The policy before was we went in, we push out the insurgents, and then we install the Iraqi army, and they sort of walk around as the police force. So I'm not quite sure the Kurds are going to be more effective than they've been. I think they can defend their battle space, but it's hard for them to move into Sunni territory and have success, and they're the only partner that's sort of on the ground. The Iraqi army is being assisted by the Iranian militias and so forth, but the real ground power to push ISIS out will be U.S. military ground power. What I think the presidential candidates don't understand is the amount of troops required for such an operation. There was a 4-division setup in Iraq. There was a Baghdad division, there was a Tikrit division, there was a Mosul division, and there was an Anbar division. We've lost 3 of 4 of those areas, and you're talking right there 100,000 troops to 150,000 troops in offensive ops. That doesn't take you to the Syria side of the border. So even if you were to retake that battle space and reinstall the Iraqi army, you'd still need additional troops to go to the Syrian side, and then you're going to meet the Russian army and the Syrian army under the current predicament. So I think the situation is much more complicated than any of the presidential candidates are talking about. And I think when they talk about boots in the ground, they need to be talking in the hundreds of thousands, if that's really what they want to do, and not the tens of thousands, unless they want to continue to just sort of, hit the strategic targets of, ISIS leadership. But if you really want to take terrain, hold terrain, and rebuild it, you would need hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops and a political framework in place that would allow for their success.
It's hard to imagine an immediate political situation that would allow for that as we're sitting here. It strikes me that it's time for the last kind of going around the circle here, and I want to end really where we began with the observation that terrorism, counterterrorism, kind of uniquely joins foreign policy, domestic politics, and the politics of fear together. We're seeing vivid demonstrations of that every day. Just watch one of Donald Trump's speeches, which I had the pleasure of doing last night on MSNBC. And I guess I'm going to end by asking each of you, or putting each of you in the position of being a briefer to the next president, the president-elect, as it were, in November 2016. And I'm asking each of you to take a few minutes to tell me what you would say to him or to her about counterterrorism policy. This is a chance, presumably, for a new beginning in January 2017. I'll start with Steve. What would be your words to the new president?
I think I would emphasize 2 things. First, that you should not try to do a violent social engineering in the Arab and Islamic world, because it inevitably triggers precisely the kind of reaction, and we don't know how to do that anyway, as a number of the people in this conversation have already indicated for various reasons. But equally important, I would be telling the next president that he has to, or he or she rather, has to have a sustained effort to educate the American people about the actual nature of the danger that they face, that there's no way to turn this problem into zero. You can't drive the terrorism risk to zero, because we live in an open society, and even police states, much stricter states, have faced it. But at the same time, it is not an existential threat, and we, in fact, play into their hands, as Obama indicated the other night, if we allow irrational fears to dominate our discussion and ultimately dominate our reaction. You can't do that with a single presidential speech. That has to be a sustained campaign of education over a number of years. And I think if we don't do that, then the politics of paranoia are going to dominate this, and we will end up taking steps that unwittingly make this problem worse.
Rachel, what is your briefing for the new president?
Well, I would start with Madam President, and then I would move on from there. I think the first thing to remember is that your legacy is much longer than this war, and your legacy needs to be one that you will uphold throughout history, and that means upholding the civil liberties of our country, the words on the base of the Statue of Liberty, and the Constitution. And so anything that goes against those bastions of what our democracy is, you will regret. Once you start with that policy set, you then need to look at how you deal with the terrorists abroad. And dealing with the terrorists abroad requires engaging the region much more deeply than we've been able to do so far, and explaining to the American people why we're engaging the region. Finally, we need to deal with the terrorist threat here, and that requires gun control. And I think we really need to get serious about talking about our gun situation here in America, which fuels not just terrorism, but much more death than terrorism is causing here, and frankly death in Central America all the way down the isthmus. And that's not just control of guns, but it's dealing with the mental illness issues in America, and it's dealing with a lot of the issues surrounding the gun economy in America and the culture of guns in America.
Okay, Suzanne, could you give your briefing for the new president?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I would say we need to look at whether, in terms of Assad, there is a strategy that would sequence this and defer the goal of his ouster in the name of I think could be bearable. I think people could understand why we were doing that, and then it could be explained. And I think the logic of it, is already being articulated. So, at the very least, that needs to be looked at. I think there's a very different kind of campaign that needs to be waged against ISIS that's much broader and more nimble and appealing, and we probably need some outside help in terms of how to message that and who can become part of that, and the role of Muslim Americans in that. But we need to get at that right away. And I agree on the gun control point. I think whether it was sort of the but for in this case in San Bernardino or not, it's an invitation for too many people. It's yet one more thing that sort of lowers the barrier to committing acts like this, and it's something that's within our power to address. So we need to figure out the politics to make something happen.
Finally, John, you're up with briefing the new president in November 2016.
Well, unfortunately, based on the poll numbers, the fact that 53% of Americans want U.S. troops back on the ground, I do believe there'll be large amounts of U.S. forces on the ground. And I always say this to every politician I meet, every senator, or if I ever was to meet the president, I would certainly say to them that never ask the American military, the good kids who've signed up from all over the country to serve, never ask them to be more committed to the peace and prosperity of a foreign country than the indigenous population. And what that's really arguing is make sure there's a larger framework and vision, because we can go in and we can kill a lot of people. We can win every battle there is, but if you're asking us to be more committed than the people on the ground to peace or to what their end state is, then in the end we won't be successful.
That vision of troops on the ground in the Middle East is a grim one, and it reminds me, or brings me back to the original image of Osama bin Laden waking up on September 12, 2001 and having a vision of the future, 14 years in the future, in which not only Al-Qaeda would continue and many of its franchises in Yemen and elsewhere would be thriving, but you would have a second international terrorist network that has as its base a state the size of the United Kingdom, governing 8 or 9 million people, and that is growing, to which recruits are migrating by the thousands every month. It strikes me that we've had an awful lot of intelligent and interesting and provocative proposals here today, but very often our center of gravity is politics. That is that as we sit here today and look at the political discussion in the United States, these views that you've heard articulated in many cases so well tend to be on the defensive. They're defensive views. And the vital driving positions tend to be those activist views that seem to me to be doing precisely what the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda would want the United States to do, which is to send forces directly into the Middle East to, in various ways, surveil and forbid and divide this country by separating out Muslim citizens, and other proposals that would fit perfectly into the Islamic State's strategy. So I guess I return to the melancholy fact that though we have many intelligent proposals that deserve discussion, there are more fundamental forces at work in the discussion than what's smart and what's not. There is the driving force of fear, which is politically irresistible for many politicians. They see it, they need to use it, and the press finds it irresistible as well. And it seems to me there's a situation now in which you have the terrorist working with certain politicians in the United States and Europe, and the press collaborating. That is, I think, the political situation that is very, very difficult to solve, and we're going to see that in this political season evolve over the next months, I think. Everybody remember the statement by Osama bin Laden in the last week of the 2004 campaign, which may well have cost John Kerry the presidency. It's deeply disturbing to me, the political effect of the so-called war on terror, and I still call it that, on our country's politics. But having said all that, thank you very much for taking part in this discussion today. I hope it'll open these issues in the minds of many people and that the discussion will continue. It's been an honor to take part in it with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, too. And really awesome conversation. Thank you so much, Mark. But thanks, everyone here. And hopefully these ideas will actually get some traction and we'll actually be able to shift that politics that you've laid out there at the very end. Anyhow, thank you very much.